Welcome to Authors at Drucker. I'm Dave Specht, Director of the Global Family Business Institute at the Drucker School of Management. At the Drucker School, we are excited to be able to offer this interview series. This interview series is funded by the James E. Hughes Jr. Foundation. The foundation is dedicated to advancing the study of family governance and generational well-being. We at the Drucker School feel very aligned and very grateful for Jay and his foundation and for making these conversations possible. On our last Authors at Drucker, we featured a book called Small Giants, Companies That Choose to Be Great Instead of Big. I was joined by Bo Burlingham and Paul Spiegelman. Paul is the founder of the Small Giants community, and Bo wrote that book. If you missed it, I would encourage you to check it out. It was a really interesting conversation. Before we get started, I'm going to share a couple of announcements that we have. The first is our certificate program in advising family enterprises. We are partnering with institutions, financial institutions, CPA firms to do this training. And if you'd like to learn more about it, again, it's about being better as an advisor at the intersection of the financial and non-financial issues that these business owning families face. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please feel free to reach out to me. The next one is our Generational Wealth Masterclass content I recorded with Jay Hughes. If you're interested in learning more about that content, please feel free to, again, reach out to me. And now on to the star of our show. I will stop sharing and I will introduce my guest today. Sudev Sheth is the senior lecturer in history at both the Lauder Institute and the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. He was previously the Harvard Newcomen Fellow in Business History at Harvard Business School, where he taught both MBA and doctoral students. His research interests include the social and cultural history of South Asia, as well as business history and family enterprise in past and present societies. Today, we're going to be visiting about his new book, Bankrolling Empire, Family Fortunes, and Political Transformation in Mughal India. Sudev, welcome to Authors at Drucker, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Sudev, your book was a fascinating combination of historical facts, incredible stories, and some interesting interplay between financiers and politicians in 17th century India. I'm wondering if you would please provide us maybe some backstory on how you came to this as a topic, because I'm not sure all of us have all that backstory on that history.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for hosting a book discussion around a book that's not typical of what we read in North America. So this is a book that focuses squarely on South Asia, the Indian subcontinent. And before I jump into how I came to the topic, let me say a bit more about the environment that is India during this time period. So the book focuses largely on the 17th and 18th centuries, and it focuses on a political formation known as the Mughal Empire. For those who are less familiar, the Mughal Empire was a mighty land-based agrarian empire, and it's most famous for being the patrons of monumental architecture such as the Taj Mahal. So if you may not be familiar with the empire, you might certainly know one of the seven wonders of the world, which is the Taj Mahal. And this particular formation came to be in the 16th century, actually, when some military entrepreneurs from Central Asia in modern-day Uzbekistan realized that the mountainous steeps from which they belonged to provided little sustenance and source of wealth, especially lack of agriculture was sort of a hindrance to their growth. And India was seen as a place of immense promise. So if you just look at any map, and if you look at where India is located, you'll notice on its northern borderlands, it's very rocky and very difficult terrain in these parts of the world. So these conquerors made their way to South Asia, to modern-day India. Now, India is a country of hundreds and thousands of rivers, vast agrarian wealth, and for the early conquerors, they focused on the fact that India had sophisticated counting systems. For them, that was proxy for great wealth. And even though they didn't particularly like the environment because it was hot, humid, and dry, and they missed the warm baths and musk melons of Central Asia, they were attracted to the immense wealth that India possibly possessed. And they gambled correctly. Their gamble was in the right place, and India did indeed possess immense amount of agrarian wealth. So the Mughal Empire was founded by a Central Asian military entrepreneur named Babur, and it was his son and successors, his children, who built this into a credible, sizable political formation in the 16th and 17th centuries. As far as my own thinking about the topic, I was very curious, having lived 3-4 years in India as a student, about what happened to this mighty formation. So I would drive around my motorcycle and I would see all these amazing monuments that were left behind by this mighty empire. But I always thought to myself, the story of its consolidation are pretty straightforward, but really what happened to it? How did it disappear? And why don't we see any real remains of it anymore? And it is that question that I sought to answer through years of research that I did, the final product being the book that you have in front of you. To give you a quick brief synopsis of the book tries to understand the downfall of empire from the lens of non-imperial or non-state sources. Oftentimes we think of a corporation or an entity's demise, and we tend to rely on documentation produced by that very mature institution to tell that story. But the question I had and the perspective I bring is, what if we tell stories of rise and fall from the perspective of non-state actors, from perspective of those who are not necessarily representatives of centralized authority, but those who are either working with it, allied to it, or in some cases, just bystanders, people who are observing the rise and fall of empire. And I came to the topic with very open eyes and open mind. I didn't have a preconceived notion of how this actually took place, but several years and months of research led me to the conclusion that existing explanations were not complete. Those focused on, for example, peasant uprising and peasant oppression as a reason for the empire's collapse, on the indolence and laziness of imperial officials as an explanation for why the empire collapsed, and so on and so forth. What I realized through my research, in fact, was that it was financial scarcity, a financial crisis of sort, that engendered slow and eventual demise of empire. This might sound very common to those who are familiar with stories of statecraft in Europe, but this is a new perspective to bring for a story focusing on South Asia and India in particular.
Well, one of the things I was interested in was looking at just how you pieced this together. And I think for our listeners today, it might be helpful for them to understand, like, how do you gather this information? And it seems like a beautiful tapestry that you've kind of been able to bring together. Can you give us some insight as to, what were the artifacts, what were some of the research pieces that you used to be able to kind of connect the dots?
Great question. Typically, when we think of an archive, we think of a centralized repository with documents that have been amassed by a group of thoughtful individuals that then historians can tap into. And this is often true for large business families with robust collecting practices. If you think of the Rothschild family, for example, in Europe, there's an archive that you can go to. In fact, there's several archives that you can go to piece this history together. For South Asia and for Indian business families, this is simply not the case. And this is for two reasons. One, documenting practices are different around the world. And we have to be aware and cognizant of the fact that different cultures collect materials and think about materials in a very different manner than do Western firms or European firms. Second, environment plays a big role in this. And as I mentioned, Babur noticed in the 16th century that India was dry and humid. Much hasn't changed in the 21st century. So we've lost a lot of documentation to the environment. So that poses unique challenges in terms of how do you write a robust history of family enterprise and even political power over time in a place where those materials are not easily accessible. So for me, as I was thinking about this project, I made two conscious moves. The first move was to move away from documents produced by the Mughal Empire themselves. So I used those materials, but they were not my primary focus. And the second move I made was, well, if we don't have family business archives, what other kinds of materials can we bring to bear in terms of thinking about the role of family enterprise in political power and in statecraft? And the answer is, there are so many other materials that you can look at. So I'll give you a range of examples. One set of materials I looked at were royal orders that were passed down from the Mughal Empire to illustrious business families in the locality. And these have been preserved in local archives and private libraries, often belonging to religious trusts and belonging to the families themselves. So the family is a great place to start. And in India, many of them have large go downs where they've kept documentation, but they often don't know what is in them. So I had to actually persuade one of the families I look at that I'm pretty sure your family, being so illustrious, would certainly have materials. Can you please make a better effort to look at your attic and look at your go down and see what you can come up with? And I was very fortunate that I was able to harness some materials that way. But I also looked at another set of materials that encompassed religious texts, so praise poems written in local languages by religious figures who were being patronized or were under the purview of some of these leading business families. I look at European travel logs across multiple languages. I'm grateful to Dutch, Portuguese, French, and English travelers who made their way to Western India, which, by the way, has about 1,000 kilometers of coastline. So there was plenty of coastline for them to dock at to conduct business. But they were great ethnographers. They took wonderful notes. And of course, they have their own preconceived biases. But we as historians should use those sources with gratitude. So I used those materials. And then I also relied on low-level bureaucrats and personal diaries. These are hard to find, but I was lucky to find one in particular, which is held at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. It's an early 18th century text of a very low-level bureaucrat. You can think about someone who might be relatively insignificant in the larger scheme of the Mughal Empire, but was a prolific writer. And this individual took ethnographic notes and compiled daily news reports in his environment into a single book-like manuscript. So I had to be very creative in the kind of materials I looked at. And another challenge I faced was language, because language is something that is only standardized in the 19th century with the advent of lithographic printing and the widespread use of dictionaries. But if you look at even early American writing or early English writing, spelling is not conventional. Orthography, meaning handwriting, is also not conventional, and so on and so forth. So it's not enough to just get the documentation. You have to then be able to sit down and read it. And I cannot claim that I did it all by myself. I have many scholarly friends. I have local support of people who know languages better than I do. And we would sit together and we would read them together. But yes, I had to learn several languages in order to piece this story together. For
That's
all of those
incredible.
people in the audience,
That's
for all the
incredible
people in the
background.
audience who work with businesses and business families, the one thing I will say is archiving is very important. And what you think may not be relevant today is certainly going to be important for someone tomorrow. So if anyone has any power in this Zoom conference to help with archiving and archiving practices, it's something I'm a big advocate of.
Yeah, I wanted to go there in terms of just practicality. Like, what are some of the things that you would encourage as a family is beginning to um, orchestrate and tell their own story, gather their own archive? What are some of the documents? What are some of the things that you think would be most helpful to tell their own story?
I was very fortunate to find Wasiyat Nama, which in Persian language means sort of the will or the trust of a particular patriarch. And this
Mm,
happened to be in a museum in Karachi, in Pakistan, which,
mm,
in those days we were all part of the same subcontinent, the South Asian subcontinent, but now it's two different nation states. And in that Wasiyat Nama, I have very clear indication of what the genealogy of this family is. Something as simple as establishing father-son relations is really, really important. But what I noticed in those documents, the important female members of the household were also documented very well. And that's a very important aspect of this. We tend to document those who are in the limelight, but I think people should think about those others who are part of the larger household that are equally important. But I think anything around decision making, how decisions are made, how people deliberate different and difficult junctures along their decision making journey. I think aspects of family life, family dynamics is very important. This is something that's very important and emerging literature in business history and business studies, which is so many decisions are not based on any kind of economic rationality. In fact,
yeah,
the premise of all business schools, including the one that I teach at, tends to be rational choice theory. Now we're moving away from that slowly, but I think people still assume that we make decisions based on rational choice. But the truth is, families are much more complex than that. So anything that can shed light on that would be really, wonderful for historians to have.
that's
Um,
great context.
photographs, paintings, personal lists, inventories of things people have collected. You can learn a lot about a family based on what they've collected, for example. But I can go on and on. Anything that you think is
Yeah.
possible to collect is worth collecting. But I think just prioritizing archiving and collecting is a very important part of family business enterprise.
All right. Let's dive in. In the introduction, you talk about a key argument that the book seeks to solve, and maybe you already alluded to it, but can you tell us a little bit about that? You talk about Karen Leonard and how she advocated the great firm theory of Mughal decline, suggesting that banking firms were responsible for the state's demise, and then you talk about John F. Richards. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. I don't want to put everyone to sleep in terms of historiographical debates. These are academic things, and we have to find our place within a large academic literature. But it is no doubt important, and I'll give a brief outline of why this is important. Um, in the 60s and 70s, anthropologists who were traveling around the world working on various societies brought some very important insights to historians. And that insight was state power is never all encompassing. Historians have had a tendency to think about empire, state, nation state, etc., as wall to wall carpets, as sort of all encompassing, all powerful, and all knowing. But anthropologists who are working at the very local levels brought to us a new understanding of state power, which was much more punctuated, much more concentrated. So you might want to think of it as a patchwork quilt or a tree with certain branches where power is very concentrated and visible, and other spaces and other areas where it's less so. It is with this insight that Karen Leonard, as an anthropologist, suggested that the Mughal Empire was not all powerful and all encompassing, but rather depended on private financiers and capital to build state infrastructure and to conduct business. Her most severe critic was, of course, a good old historian who said that is absolutely not true, that the Mughal Empire was all powerful and had very robust state finances and did not rely on any form of private capital to uphold state infrastructure. Now, academics have to be very polite in their writing, but this was a very contentious debate. And if you read in between the lines of the articles they wrote, they were not very friendly with each other. However, they were both right in their own regard. The only problem was that at that time, they didn't have any empirical evidence, any families that they could actually root their observations in to assess whether which hypothesis was correct. So they had all these wonderful theoretical ideas, but they didn't have a single family that traversed time to be able to assess what role families have actually played in empire. For that to happen, you need a family that's been a part of imperial formation, high tide of empires functioning, and also families that have outlasted those empires to see, what the changes were over time. So it is equipped with their insights, their hunches that I kind of brought the empirical materials to bear. And the conclusion I came up with was that it wasn't the case that the empire really relied on private capital to function, but it began relying on private capital during moments of exceptional need. So
Yeah.
initially, it wasn't that the empire needed private capital. They were perfectly happy with agrarian revenues, poll taxes, and they were also a conquest state. So they were pushing frontiers of conquest. But once they reached a limit, and there were moments of exceptional need and no new sources of revenue, well, it turns out capitalists are great places to go if you actually need that capital. So it is that story that I'm tracing, which is the slow induction or the slow introduction of private capital resources, knowledge, know-how into projects of statecraft and empire building. And it turns out family businesses are at the heart of this. We know this for Europe, but guess what? The story holds true for South Asia, really in parts of all of Asia during this period.
That's a great backdrop. So I want to get into a couple of the kind of main characters or families that you follow. A couple of these crucial families, one, the Javerdis and the Hari Bhaktis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but
That's
do you want to
correct,
share
yeah.
a little bit of maybe about each of them and the roles that they played? Maybe pick a story or two that are of interest.
Sure. I'll happily do that. So there are two families, and the first family I focus on is called the Javeri family, and they are based in modern day Ahmedabad in Western India in the state of Gujarat. Ahmedabad has been around since 1411 as a city of commerce, a city of trade, a city of political activity. The name Javeri is actually an occupational namesake. You might think of something like carpenter or knight or tailor, miller, a fisher. We have these names which were very much linked to the occupation of the family. So Javeri means jeweler, someone involved in the trade and exchange of precious commodities, that is jewelry. And so Javeri is really a surname or an occupational namesake belonging to many Javeris in the city of Ahmedabad. This particular family that I'm focusing on, the patriarch Shantidas Javeri, happens to just be the most prominent merchant of the city. So he became known as the Javeri, right? So it's sort of like the carpenter of the town, right? And so this family got their initial trade in gemology. They were experts at assaying jewels and coins, precious metal, because in those days you had to be able to spot a very, very precious diamond and tell the difference between that diamond and maybe one of inferior quality. So they built that specialization. And of course, no surprise, elites like shiny objects. And it was to the court of the Mughal emperor that Shantidas Javeri, this particular jeweler, started ingratiating himself. So he started small. He learned the trade from his father and grandfather, who were small-time jewelers, but he became really good at this. And he became the chief jeweler or the chief peddler of these kind of nice, rare commodities, often coming from the New World. So he was not just doing jewelry, but eventually got into sourcing peppers from the Americas, turkeys from the Americas, and many other kind of commodities and products that were meant for royal consumption. This family built their fortune in the jewelry trade, and over time, political leaders identified their wealth as a source of capital during political crises, and we can talk about that a little bit later. I'll hold off on that. The second family is the Hari Bhakti family, and I focus on that family because there's a dearth of evidence for the Javeri family during their later years. It's quite interesting that we actually lose archival material in some of the later period. And to make up for that, I had to find another family that is analogous or similar to this family to continue the story. So this family emerges in the 18th century in a city near Ahmedabad called Baroda. And it is in this city that this family starts money lending to political upstarts. And the reason that these two families are important in my story is that in the case of the Javeri family, they rise and fall with political power in some sense. But the Hari Bhakti family, the later 18th century family, is sort of an insignificant family to begin with. And they only become significant as new political upstarts require capital from their very inception to form state power. To put it more simply, the Mughal Empire was fiscally solvent. It had enough revenues to pay its debts, but the states that followed the Mughal Empire, the states that came after it, did not have any robust sources of revenue, and they relied on private capital, you can call it venture capital, so to speak, from these small families who were gambling their wealth on projects of statecraft. It's a different matter that they lost all their investments in the 19th century, and many of them had their noses in the ground. But at that time, investing in political projects seemed very, very promising, much like today's AI, possibly. I don't know where that's going to go, but that was the thing to invest in the 18th century, which is, various political projects, and everyone was willing to give money for this particular enterprise. So these two families are kind of exemplars or very good examples of how we think about the role of money and family in political change, and they serve as conduits into larger stories that I tell.
So as you think about, where some of this infusion of capital happened, I mean, it seems like in the book you talk about, where there were maybe an uprising and they needed to raise an army or they wanted to push out into new frontiers. Can you give us a couple of examples of where this capital was used? Because it seemed like it needed to be, it was like quick capital, like they needed it, and that was why these families were able to get involved.
Let me tell you something about how pre-modern elections used to work. So the transfer of power from father to son or from rival to rival was never seamless in 17th and 18th century India. There was no democracy, there was no voting. And the best way you could assert authority is the might of your sword. So, the idea of violent bids for the throne is a very common feature of Central Asian and South Asian statecraft. And in fact, even though it was violent and gruesome, one might argue, as a scholar by the name of Munis Farooqi at UC Berkeley has, that princely competition, even though it was very violent, was very healthy for the functioning of the Mughal Empire. And so this exceptional political crisis that I'm referring to is when brothers are fighting it out for succession. And we know that succession planning and succession in family businesses is as contentious now as it was in the past. And so it is in this moment that brothers would gather armies, provincial armies, and any kind of additional resource could be the difference between life and death and between being a loser in princely tournaments for emperorship and becoming emperor. To give you a sense of costs and to give you a sense of how much money families provided, you're looking at about 500,000 or 500,000 rupees in cash that they would provide at any given moment. And this would be enough to sustain a fairly large provincial army for 1 month. To give you a sense of the purchasing power of 1 rupee in those days, you could buy about 10 kilograms of wheat for 1 rupee. You could probably get processed indigo for about 5 to 10 rupees. You could probably purchase a slave for between 1 and 3 rupees. And ordinary day laborers, the ordinary carpenter or personal servant, would earn something like 1 to 4 rupees per month. So 500,000 rupees, 500,000 rupees was a pretty sizable sum. And a firm like Shantidas Javedi's banking firm was able to provide 500,000, 1 million, up to 2-3 million rupees at any given time. So you can imagine the kind of power that they wielded and the kind of influence they had, especially if a prince needed that amount on the spot. It was princely rivalries for the throne that brought private business and family business into the politics of statecraft, much like election cycles tend to highlight the kind of donations that certain family businesses and firms make to certain political parties. And unlike our modern times where often you're hedging your bets with one party, these families were very smart and they would fund multiple princes with the hope that whoever came to power would still be in their favor.
Interesting diversification strategies going on back then.
Certainly.
Do you have any examples of, was it the pattern, these brotherly battles, these sibling rivalries? Was that the norm, or did families typically stay together, but some broke off? Like, what was normal back then?
Yes. So Central Asian statecraft was one where eliminating rivals, especially brothers or even fathers, we call it patricide or fratricide, was a common practice of Central Asian statecraft. And this is something that was inherited in the South Asian context. It's very important to think about what kind of political practices are suitable for what kind of environments. Central Asia was typically a mountainous region, mountainous steeps, where traversing large areas was very difficult. It was almost nomadic in that nature. So one could either fight for the throne or the right to carry the family legacy forward. One could abscond and find another part of Central Asia to kind of build their own influence, or one could fight a tooth and nail and often leading to death. And that was very common in those environments. But in South Asia, which was agriculturally rich, where this empire established itself as a landed polity, this practice of fratricide became common, but after a certain point was no longer sustainable because the empire was actually very, very rich, very, very wealthy, and had no new frontiers to actually kind of expand into, right? So you kind of run out of space to kind of partake in brotherly rivalries. So yes, they were very common. They did take place. And as I mentioned, other scholars have argued that it was the attrition of this practice, of this institution of fighting for the throne, that eventually led to the demise of the Mughal Empire. In fact, the last reigning emperor of the Mughal Empire outlived himself. He lived into his 90s. And we see this very common in family businesses where you have a patriarch or a matriarch who's not willing to let go when the timing is right. And in some cases, they overstay their welcome. And when I say their welcome, I mean really institutionally, they overstay what is requisite for the institution, and that has detrimental effects. So one could argue that the last major Mughal emperor wasn't able to have a very robust succession plan. And in fact, that opened the floodgates for poor rivals to kind of come in his place, and they were not well equipped to build the empire further. So that's a long-winded way of saying that, yes, this practice was very common. And there came a point where rivals ceased to be eliminated. And then you had many, many more people in the royal household who actually had legitimate claim to royal resources. And that then, of course, diluted those resources, akin to fragmentation of holdings in some senses.
Yeah.
So it led to kind of a bifurcation of these resources, or a piecemeal breakup of these resources. So the patterns are very common. It's a very different time period.
Yeah,
those patterns are
those patterns are happening today. I mean, when you have a rising generation that is not fighting for, leadership, not interested maybe even in leading a family company. And I think that is where the demise of the family company is when there's not that sort of hunger and ambition to lead and to grow and to expand into new frontiers. That's where you see others, coming in and buying out family-owned companies. I think those parallels are really interesting.
Yes, certainly.
You talk about kind of some framing concepts to capture the state-capital relations between the 16th and 18th century Gujarat.
Yes.
And you talk about, there's 4 of them. So courtly mutualism, political commensalism, expedient extortion, and competitive coparcenry. Now that's a lot.
Yeah.
So let's take on maybe one at a time. What is courtly mutualism, and how does it show up?
Okay. So these are 4 framing concepts that I use to kind of trace the relationship between state power and private capital or private enterprise. And I think these concepts can be applied to even our modern day relations when you think about, political power and powerful family businesses. So courtly mutualism is the idea that during an early stage of empire, when resources were plentiful and there was very little political crises, the relationship between state power and private enterprise or family business was one of mutualism, was one where there was a free exchange of ideas, free exchange of gifts, free exchange of privileges back and forth. And that mutualism was beneficial to both sides. The state benefited because the Javaidis procured items of rare occurrence for them, diamonds, New World crops, bullion from coins coming into the various ports, and so on and so forth. And the families benefited because they had customers for everything that they were willing to sell, let alone some state protection and patronage. So it was a relationship that was quite beneficial, and it was mutualistic. Often when 2 sides don't really need something but benefit from what's exchanged, that mutualism is quite beautiful and can be quite useful. However, this relationship changes because when you're exchanging things freely and gifts are flowing back and forth, there is some sense of mutual obligation. If not now, you're deferring that obligation to a future date. And political commensalism simply captures that deferring of debts, social debts. When political leaders realize they need money and are basically soft arming these capitalists to say, look, there's an election on the horizon. I have brothers to fight. I need 5.5 million rupees or 500,000 rupees to be able to kind of partake in this princely rivalry. Now, they ask politely during this phase of political commensalism, akin to a political donation, right, to a party.
Yes.
And nothing is really expected in return. So I call it commensalism because one side benefits, which is the political side, the state, and the other side is not necessarily harmed or doesn't benefit in any obvious immediate way, right? I'm using kind of ecology.
Can I jump in real quick? I was going to ask, so when these sorts of loans take place, how are they secured? Are they secured with land? How are they being secured?
Very good question. So they're typically secured with revenues from land that the state alienates to the capitalist to say, okay, we've borrowed 5.5 thousand rupee, 550,000 rupees, half a million. And the revenues from XYZ village or locality will be used when they're realized a year from now to pay you back. And oftentimes there's interest, but in many cases there is no interest. So it just depends on the kind of loan it is. But again, it's not immediate repayment. It's sort of like you're hoping for, from the capitalist perspective, you're hoping for the social elevation of whoever you're funding to help you out in terms of repayment of the loan. So you're hoping that the prince that you're backing becomes emperor, because it's really then that you will truly benefit from any money gambled on election season, right? So it's sort of like, again, no surprise that there are parallels, right? But when you're making that political donation, there's no immediate return except for a tax deduction receipt, perhaps. But you're really hoping on the social elevation of the party that you're subscribing to, with the hope that it pays dividends socially and politically otherwise. So commensalism really captures this kind of moment of it's not extortion, but it's really soft asking. And the third phase I come to is a phase which is much more violent indeed. It's really behind the scenes extortion of those who are close to sources of political power, in this case, family businesses who have gambled their wealth. And these political leaders know that these families have this money. And I kind of frame this as extortion because they don't really have a choice. So they're actually subjugated to immense violence in the locality, both publicly and privately. And in fact, in the case that I'm looking at, their wealth is excavated. So there were no robust banks to kind of put your wealth in. So oftentimes this treasure was buried in people's homes, in between hollow walls, and so on and so forth. So these political leaders are sending their men to the households of these bankers, and they're literally physically digging up the evidence, both, in and around the house and in the walls where treasure was buried. And the final kind of phase that I'm looking at is what I'm calling competitive coparcenary, where all private streams of capital run dry. At least they're not made available anymore, despite violence. And there are many more contenders on the scene, akin to, let's say, a coalition government, for example. You have this in parliamentary forms of government where, parties have to negotiate with each other and come up with a coalition because we all want the same thing that we can't accomplish individually. And competitive coparcenary is that world where rights to land and rights to political power are made and agreed upon contractually. And this happens really in the 18th century with the rise of the British East India Company, which says, look, violence is no way for any of us to benefit from the revenues that are coming in. And we have to think of other more robust mechanisms to parcel out power and parcel out prestige. And this is where in the 18th and 19th century, you get hundreds of small little princes. Everyone thinks about India as a land of princes, but these are largely, in some cases, figments of people's imagination. They're princes who are given little plots of land. It's almost like the idea that I'm the prince of my own house, but what does that really mean? It doesn't really mean a whole lot, right? I mean, for the record, I'm not the prince of my own house, but
Nor
the idea
am
that
I.
nor the sovereignty is very delimited, right? But it doesn't mean a whole lot when you don't have much revenue coming in. So these four phases, just to clarify, are tracked over time. So courtly mutualism is a kind of relationship that state power and capitalists have until about 1658. This changes to political commensalism in the late 17th century as political competition between rival princes increases for the throne. This then morphs into what I'm calling expedient extortion between 1707 and 1730, about a 3-4 decade period, when the Mughal Empire is really desperate for cash and they have no other recourse but to violently beat and extort capitalists in the locality. And then this kind of comes to a resolution post 1730 with the advent and the rise of foreign trading companies and local forms of political power, where really there are just many more people in the market who have legitimate right to resources. And again, daily violence is no way to solve that. So they turn to principles of diplomacy and contractual obligations. So if you think about that, it's a very important shift in how state power is thought of, one in which you go from military adventurism and consolidating land and authority through the might of the sword and through some combination of administrative knowledge to one that is really just contractual, and you're farming out the rights to revenue. You're thinking about financial futures. You're giving someone, I'm giving you, Dave, a contract for this particular land for 5 years, and you're paying me an advance sum. And whatever you realize is your own entrepreneurial might. So if you pay me $100 for the next 5 years, if you make 125 over the next 5 years, the 25 is your keeping. And we see this shift in 18th century India. And that's what I'm really trying to trace through the lens of capitalists. So it's a mouthful, I know, but I think these concepts, courtly mutualism, political commensalism, expedient extortion, and competitive coparcenary, will find parallels in our own modern political life.
So I may draw some conclusions here that are uncomfortable, but in the United States, it feels like rather than the relationship between politics and big tech, these companies that have lots of data,
Yes.
I'm seeing, as you're describing, the evolution between courtly mutualism to political commensalism. I mean, is
Yeah.
that too much of a stretch?
No, it's not, because what we're finding now, and this is why I think history is so important,
Hmm.
is the relationship between, let's just call it broadly, state power and family enterprise or private capital
Hmm.
is not linear. It's not something that you can see a clear teleology, in terms of it moving one particular way. It's come and gone in cycles and waves. And I actually think we're in a moment right now where, yes, the state has regulatory power and the state apparatus is one under which we all operate, but businesses are able to make the state bend over backward in ways that they haven't been able to do for centuries. The biggest example I can think of is Amazon. If you think about Amazon's HQ2 bid, where they basically had several American states hand over immensely valuable proprietary data about their cities, um, that's something that was very unusual and unlikely in those days, right? And so you have a situation now where a corporation actually has more information than the government possibly has, and TBD where that goes, but the relationship is certainly changing, right? And one can argue that actually private capitalists and private capital have more power than the state does. That's again a debate that we can all engage in, and we can fall on different sides. But there's evidence certainly now to suggest, with the advent of technology and being at the forefront of technology, that any state's legal apparatus, any state regulatory power are only playing catch up, right? We see this with AI
Yeah.
too now. It's like, what are we going to do? How are we going to regulate this? Or with Uber, when Uber first came, it was almost like Uber was at least 10 steps ahead of any regulation that was able to keep up with it. Airbnb is another example of that. Um,
Well, and
During the phase
you
that I'm
think of
focusing
Google,
on,
you think of Google and Facebook and all the data that they have, and how the government, how the political parties would like to have that so that they could
yes.
know and
Oh,
influence,
yes. Oh,
elections
yes.
and how people feel. And so it really was interesting for me to read your book and like think about, okay, what's happening today that we can learn
Oh,
from
yes.
in
Oh,
learning
yes.
from history.
Absolutely. And in the case of South Asia, I may want to just emphasize one thing, that the family that I look at in this book is still around now in their, you can say, between their 12th and 15th generation, running one of India's most recognized family businesses and family brands, the Arvind Group. They're based in Ahmedabad, and they're one of the world's largest producers of denim fabric and other kind of textiles. And they now have a diversified interest in many other industries, but they're a multi-billion-dollar family conglomerate that has been around since the 16th century. So one of the big learnings that I had, it might be very common knowledge to all of you because you know family business better than I do. But for me, I was just surprised and amazed at the fact that states come and go, but family businesses are here to stay. And the strategies that this family has used to survive political crises of enormous magnitude, which is South Asian history, um, it's just remarkable, right? They've survived the rise and fall of the Mughal Empire. They've survived the rise and fall of native local states where endemic violence was rampant. They've survived the rise and fall of the British Empire, the British colonial presence, the post-colonial state, and since 1991, the liberalized Indian state, right? So between 1947 and 1991, India was really a closed economy. It was closed off to capitalist enterprise for various reasons, but they were still surviving during that period. So they've really demonstrated amazing resilience. I'm not saying it was easy because the evidence suggests otherwise, but I'm much more inclined to follow family businesses where they go than I am to follow state power. And that's my big learning from this book.
Oh, I'm going to quote you on that one. That is we're cheering for family businesses here. Yeah, I think, I mean, we could go on and on. There's some questions in the chat that I think people would like to ask. So let's pivot to some questions, and then if we have any more time
Sure,
at the end, I'll ask you a couple more
sure.
questions.
I'm happy to welcome all questions. So,
Let's see. Wendy, you had some questions here in the chat. Did you want to take yourself off mute? We'd love to hear from you. Do you have a specific question for Sudev?
Well, I think that really the one that popped into my head was I go back to the period where there's data and archives missing historically. I was just kind of wondering through all of your
yeah.
research, do you have any theories as to why that might be?
Such a great question. I wish we could talk more about this, but one of the things I learned in the process is in the locality, whenever there was political conflict, in several instances in my research, those who came out on top made it a point to destroy local archives. So I have in various chronicles discussions that are elaborate about the ransacking of local offices, of local archives, and they were keen to destroy any evidence of existing property rights, any loans, any forgeries, and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, the axiom in history is sort of true that history is typically written by the victors, right? Typically by the winners, because they have the evidence and they tend to preserve the materials. Counterfactual history or histories of lost materials are rarely discussed. And so that's a very, very good and thoughtful question. But yes, we're missing history and we're missing evidence from periods where political crises and uprisings typically took place because there was a conscious ransacking and destruction of family papers and state papers. So again, that's a very, very good question. But
Great.
yes, there is a correlation.
Thank you, Wendy. Rajiv, I wonder if we could turn to you for your question. Would you like to take yourself off mute and ask your question to Sudev?
Sure, thanks. The question was, did you get a sense of how much of the family's capital ended up getting committed into these kinds of empire-related or contender to the throne-related lending?
Yes.
Obviously, there was some coercion involved.
Yes. Yes. Very good question. So, unfortunately, because the family didn't keep close records, or maybe they kept close records, but we've lost it to time, we don't have any single inventory for how many loans total were given to this family. What I was able to gather was piecemeal. But what I can say is that it was very easy for this firm to give spot loans, on the spot of 500,000 to 1 million rupees in silver coin without typically any problem. So if they're able to give 500,000 or 1 million multiple times over, let's say, a month-long or 2-month-long period, we know that they had substantial capital at their disposal. This doesn't change over time. So Shantidas Javedi is one example, but his grandson, just about a century later, is giving loans that are 100,000 to 200,000 rupees multiple times over a 6-month period. So almost on like a bi-weekly basis, he's able to do that. But unfortunately, we have very little sense of what percentage that comprised of their entire portfolio. And I would be lying to myself and to you if I told you I had a very good sense of that. But it's all relative. So yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer than that, but that's the best I can do.
Good question, Rajiv.
Yeah,
I wish we had an asset allocation of how they allocated to different different leaders or different.
May I say one quick thing to Rajiv and to everyone here? Loans are not the only way to assess financial prowess. The family was also patrons of immense monumental architecture in the locality, some of which has been lost to us through temple desecration and through other kinds of acts of political and environmental loss. But we know that they built large temples, they built large public architecture and works that were monumental because we have foreign observers and local observers who have documented how marvelous this architecture is. So, if we just were to think in relative terms, anything marvelous would typically cost a lot of money. So they had money not just for fighting wars, but they had money for all kinds of other public activity, which was very important and has been documented in history.
Thank you, Sudev. My next question comes from John. John, do you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Thanks so very much. And I also will use this concept, states come and go, but family businesses are here to stay. And I will certainly give you credit. I'll use that.
Okay.
Fabulous, fabulous summation. Just curious about the four framing concepts. It progresses through, a series of steps. I'm curious if you can kind of widen out the lens a little bit. Do you see patterns like that elsewhere? Could that recur again in Southern Asia, or has it been and elsewhere in the world? And I note that Neil Howe,
Yes.
the biographer and historian, has written on the four turnings, which is a similar concept, but in a very different society and political and economic environment, the West. Just curious.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very good question. So one of the things that has been monumental in the formation of state power around the world globally has been the rise of debt states, right? States which have enormous national debts. If you look at the US national debt, it's only growing. It's not too concerning at the moment precisely because our GDP is almost kind of pegged to our national debt. But economists have told us that in about 2 decades from now or 3 decades from now, that ratio, the debt to GDP ratio, is going to be outsized and we might be in trouble. So globally speaking, this concept might be not as applicable to societies that have mature states with large national debts. When those debts are called in, we'll see what happens. But the concept is certainly applicable to emerging markets or places where the developmental state is still on the rise. So places where states are not robust, places where state formation is still taking place, or there's contention between the quality of states that are kind of coming up. And I think in those environments, just like the Mughal Empire, where there was no national debt, in fact, it was a fiscally solvent state, but it had to always negotiate its presence. So any place where you see states as fragile or states as having to kind of contend with very complex interests, I think this model could actually apply very closely, especially because those states would likely rely on local illustrious families or firms with capital at their disposal to kind of subsidize state formation. And I think that's kind of a key concept here. I think Dave was speaking earlier about the US and thinking about where we are now. I think mature states like the US, who are extremely indebted in various ways, have a different set of questions and problems to think about. And I think in that context, technology firms and other firms that have immense power will play an outsized role. So I think we have to bifurcate our understanding of state power in terms of, again, fragile state environments, fragile economies, developmental states versus those that are extremely robust. And India is now robust too, right? I mean, these families are still important, but the way they relate to political power is very, very different. They're very outsized, they have a lot of power, but they're not writing private loans to the prime minister necessarily, right? They're involved in state power in very different ways. And I think it's really interesting to peel back the guise that they're using now when compared to earlier times. I can say more about that later, but I think that's a very important question that you ask. And I think we have to keep this in mind when we think about what kind of state are we talking about here.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, John. Our time is flying, but I want to go back to the Javetis for a second. And I know with every family business, there's inflection points.
Yes.
Peter Drucker talks about systematic abandonment and stopping doing certain things in our businesses. And that is what creates space for new innovation. As you think about the different inflection points that the Javetis had to go through, what were some of those points where they actively stopped doing something and started doing something else? Because they didn't stay the Javedi family from the 16th century.
Correct. So this book only traces 4 generations of the family, but I have studied the full gamut of the family. And I'm so glad we're going to end on this note. But the hallmark of this family has been to be industry agnostic and to be attuned to political developments of the day. In fact, the family has pivoted every other generation, if not every generation, since its inception in terms of the businesses that they're involved in. So no generation has taken for granted their forefathers and foremothers' business. And to give you a very concrete example, this family was known as the most important industrialist family in the 20th century. And most recently, when I interviewed the managing director, who's now a multi-generation member of this family, for an interview I did for Harvard Business School, the pivot that they're making is going asset light now. So they're, in some cases, they're sort of selling off their large industries and entering branding. And so that's just one example, but they've really rethought every generation what is the best use of their resources and expertise. And that brings me to the final point, which is each generation has also educated themselves immensely and have not taken, again, their forefathers and mothers' learnings for granted. They've educated themselves in terms of what industries to go in, what new technologies exist, and where, again, the political climate is headed. And it's a combination of these two things, upskilling and educating oneself and being attuned to political climates that really gives them an upper advantage in terms of how to think about the longevity of their businesses, right? And I think that this family exemplifies very well. And the history that I write in the book also bears this out if you look closely, that they go from peddling jewels to political financing to financing states that need to be financed through debt. And then later entering modern industry with the rise of modern day cotton industries and the cotton mills, to then divesting themselves of those mills and entering the world of branding and real estate. So again, it's the gamut, and I can say more, and I'd be happy to share insights with everyone in this audience through separate channels. But that is a very important learning, that family businesses cannot be complacent, and they should use the next generation to educate themselves and also to be attuned to political changes in their environment.
Yeah, and I think the opportunity to invite the rising generation to continue to innovate may be something that we need to actually be more
Yes.
overt about. Like, just because I did this doesn't mean you should do that as
Yes.
well. I
Yes.
think because there's sometimes where if it's a farming family, this is what we've done. These are the crops we've always planted. And so
Yes.
there is a sense of guilt if someone turns away from doing what your father or your grandfather did.
Yes.
So I think we need to be more overt in that with family companies.
I think one way of thinking about it is knowledge through lineage is very valuable, but we can't take that for granted as relevant knowledge all the time, right? You have to kind of think about the next generation and using them. So the family's done marvelous. In fact, as early as the 40s, I believe, they sent members of their family to Harvard Business School to learn modern management techniques, to kind of think about what principles they can bring back. So in fact, the role of the CEO and the managing director for this firm is separated. So they kind of separate management and ownership. And that's something that was unusual and early for their time in Indian landscape, right? And that was really a direct import from what they learned in management schools in the US. Not to say that management schools can teach you everything perfectly. That's certainly not the case. But the willingness to adopt new concepts and try them out is a hallmark of this family, as it is of many families around the world who've demonstrated robust resilience over centuries, right?
Yes. Sudev, our time has flown. My invitation to the audience today is go buy this book. Now, it's now accessible on Abe Books. And if you just type in Abe Books and then search for Bankrolling Empire, it was only through Cambridge, but recently it's now available for like $20. And so if you enjoyed this session today, I would really encourage you to get the book, dig into it, and not only learn from history, but make some of these applications going forward so that we can spot issues for families. We can also spot issues in our own communities and our society with how things are evolving. Sudev, this has been so fun. I really appreciate you making time for us at Authors at Drucker. And yeah, again, thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks, everyone. Make it a great day.